COP27 is underway in Sharm El-sheikh in Egypt. The conference aims to address issues of climate change and help prevent dangerous impact. Many experts believe the summit is an opportunity for the continent to focus global attention on Africa's issues of drought, flooding, agriculture collapse, food security, and escalating conflicts. The continent is facing an economic crisis and millions of Africans are without electricity. South Africa is taking the message of increased funding needed for the country's new energy plan to the climate conference. To help us understand the summit and why it is so important, I'm joined now by Wits University's Julia Taylor. She's a researcher on climate and inequality. Julia, good afternoon. Welcome to Today on ENCA. Thank you very much for joining us. I guess being the first COP meeting happening on the African continent, there's one significance about that in terms of COP 2027. And Africa is going to have to make use of this opportunity to drive its message globally.
Yes, good afternoon and thanks for having me. This is actually, one of the first COPs to happen in Egypt, and we are really hoping that it can be seen as an African COP. And just to clarify, COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and that is parties to a UN climate negotiation, which started in 1992. So various treaties have been put in place internationally, and every year there's usually a COP where these treaties are negotiated. And the most recent treaty is the Paris Agreement, signed in 2015. And so part of these negotiations and treaties and agreements have led to commitments by different countries to reduce emissions, as well as to contribute to funding developing countries who are most impacted by climate change in order to transition to low carbon economies and kind of build up climate resilience so that countries in Africa particularly are able to respond when there are issues like flooding and drought. So there's a big demand this year for focus on finance and how developed countries are going to contribute and meet the commitments that they've made to provide funding to developing countries and African countries in particular.
Yeah, there's a big debate around that. Even President Ramaphosa just last week in Parliament, in answering one question about the just transition in the country, saying that while African countries like South Africa have not really been the biggest contributors to the carbon emissions in the world, they are now expected to fix the problem, but they don't have the funding. And some people are saying most of the funding must come from industrialized nations in the form of grants.
Yes, that's definitely the argument. And that's the reason that, the reason is because over 50% of cumulative global emissions were kind of produced by the US and Europe. And so those two countries, or those two regions, really hold much more responsibility than actually any African country. The total emissions from the African continent are between 3 and 4% of global emissions. So there's a huge argument to say, actually the majority of emissions come from these countries. They should be paying for the reparations almost. To make sure that countries in Africa don't, have to pay for these issues themselves. And that's called loss and damage. So there are three types of climate response, really, or policy towards climate change. One is mitigation, where we say we have to reduce emissions. The second is adaptation, where we say we have to adapt and improve our, food security, we improve our water management in order to adapt to climate change. And then the third is loss and damage, where we're saying that actually climate change has reached such a point that we can't guarantee that, we can't deny that these impacts are already being felt. And so when those issues kind of happen, for example, with the flooding in Pakistan recently, who's going to pay when it's proven that some of that flooding was due to climate change. And how are developed countries and industrialized countries going to make sure that the finance that's promised in all of these treaties is actually delivered?
Yeah, and this issue of finance funding is firmly on the agenda of COP27 in Egypt. You've just mentioned one thing, using the Pakistan example. It's very clear that a rise in temperature, a change in our climate is already locked into our current realities. I mean, just the other year, we had Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, almost destroyed Mozambique's biggest, second largest city of Beira. But there's an issue here of the impact of the Russia-Ukraine war in terms of energy. I mean, look at what's going on in Europe, Julia, and you see that many governments now have decided to prioritize security of supply of energy instead of or over the transition to cleaner energy. That could set the agenda a little bit back, or progress made a little bit back.
Yes, certainly. So, particularly in African countries, that our kind of access to electricity is not as robust as many other countries. So this example of how the Ukrainian crisis has affected energy supply in European countries is kind of proving a point that many African countries are making, where, I mean, as we know in South Africa, we're struggling with just basic kind of energy supply. So cutting off, coal resources when we don't have enough energy is a very difficult choice to make. And that's why we really need to make sure that when we make those choices, we have enough funding, we have enough support, and we have a proper plan in order to address the job losses that might happen. And that's where a just transition comes in. So a just transition is this idea that when we transition to a low carbon economy, we have to do it in a way that meets the needs of the majority of the people in the country. And so we can't jeopardize our energy security. We can't jeopardize our employment. We have to make sure that the livelihoods of people who are reliant on the coal value chain, for example, are accounted for and are planned to be kind of protected in this process of a just transition.
Yeah. Should we look to African representation to also put on the table innovative solutions around things like food security because of the drought that we are seeing in different parts of the continent? I mean, the Horn of Africa, that Ethiopia region and South Sudan, they've been experiencing a lot of starvation recently because of drought. Here at home, we've seen the impact of drought in the Eastern Cape, and where the dams are so low that some taps have literally run dry.
Yes, certainly. I think we have experience with drought. We're a water scarce country already in South Africa. And so we definitely have some kind of knowledge and expertise that we can lend, specifically in terms of food systems and water management. Those are kind of two really key issues within adaptation to climate change that need to be a focus. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, finally, you may not have seen this, but Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, addressing COP27 today, he's basically warning that we are on a highway to climate hell, to quote him, that we are headed unless something really drastic is done between now and 2030. In your view, Julia, what would need to be agreed to at this COP27 to determine whether or not we are on the highway to hell?
Yeah, that's a difficult question, but I think what we need to make sure happens in this COP is that the African group, which is kind of the group that we negotiate as part of, stands strong on the need to secure financing for African countries to kind of transition to a lower carbon economy. So we need to make sure that as we leave the conference, we have commitment and a process of monitoring that those finances are actually delivered. One of the issues has been that an amount is agreed to, but then there's all sorts of different accounting processes that mean that actually we don't agree on how much is actually being delivered. So not only do we need to feel sure that there are secure commitments, but we need to feel confident that there are measures in place to track and monitor those commitments, and that there will be repercussions and consequences if those aren't met.
Yeah, I guess the biggest one, as you said, is the first one, is around finance and funding, because in terms of who's damaged who and how much and what's the losses and what can we get, and hopefully most of it will be in grants. Thank you very much for your time and insights this hour on Today. That's Julia Taylor, researcher on climate and inequality at the University of Witwatersrand, or Wits University here in Johannesburg. Just some thoughts around COP27 that's already underway in Egypt, and our president, like other African leaders, have already made their way to that 2-week-long summit.